Hello, and welcome to Risk Awareness Week. It's a pleasure to be a part of this forum that Alex Sidorenko and the Risk Academy are behind. My first opportunity to contribute, and I appreciate Alex's invitation to do so. I'm Chris Mandel. I'm Senior Vice President of Strategic Solutions at Sedgwick in the United States and Director of the Sedgwick Institute. Sedgwick is a risk services firm, came from a broker originally based in London. We serve a lot of the biggest companies in the world with our current model. My background is risk management all the way back quite a few decades, having started in this business first in the insurance world and then migrated through the risk management chairs of a number of major companies, including Verizon Corporation, PepsiCo, and as Chief Risk Officer for USAA, a privately owned kind of mutual kind of company out of Texas, Diversified Financial Services. So I bring to you lots of years of practice and knowledge in the risk world in different ways. And frankly, as Alex and I have discussed, I want to bring to you today some thoughts about making better decisions. That is risk-informed decisions, and talk about how risk and performance outcomes are actually linked together. So, you know, you all, I'm sure, are very familiar with Alex's RM1, RM2 construct. And I understand and you know, I agree with the general construct. I'm not so sure I agree that, you know, RM1 is a 10% allocation, but we can debate that some other time. I really do believe it is, at the end of the day, about how we use risk-related information, tools, and techniques to make better decisions. And so today, my agenda will be to talk about these elements: how risks relate to decisions, how you can use information to manage your organization's risk profile, stakeholder relationships being really important, and understanding what stakeholder interests are and kind of pitching to them, if you will. Talking about strategic reporting, understanding the importance of measurement, but also the importance of monitoring and how that affects your job as a risk leader. And then I want to close with some comments on effective risk management and what I think that is. And I've done a bit of research and writing on this in the last couple of years. And of course, everybody's got different opinions about it, but maybe some of that will resonate with you. I want to encourage you to, throughout this, put your comments at the bottom of the screen and share your questions. Make sure we get good feedback from you guys is real important to us. So I'll remind you of that throughout this session. So I'd like to begin with this question. Do you think some risks matter more than others? And I use this in a lot of my speaking materials and training materials because there is an answer to this question, you know, and this might be viewed as perfunctory to most, right? A typical risk type spectrum, you know, where we have strategic, operational, financial, and in this particular construct, external risks as well. I put this up here not as an educational device, because you all know this. I put this up there really to kind of further the question, because I don't think we even really care that much about risk types, you know, except to the extent that we need to use good, solid, robust tools to capture risk information for all the different reasons we do. And we want to be consistent about that, particularly if we want to do benchmarking with other organizations and other third parties. But the fact is that so many traditional risk managers operate in this operational risk bucket, where actually hazard risk, a subset of that, is really their focal point. And of course, we know that to be risks that are insurable. That is the history of risk management in the United States, for better or for worse. I will always say that insurance is an important function, but really it's not risk management, as we all know. What is insurance? Insurance is a mitigation technique. And so the answer to the question, though, is, I think, in part from this bit of research, and while I admit it's a bit dated, I can assure you these conclusions have been revalidated more than once since. I like to use this slide because I think it tells the story pretty well graphically. And that story is pretty simple, that in this case, surveying a large number of organizations over a specific period of time. When 50% or more of the value was destroyed in an organization, it was 68% of the time from a strategic risk. And if you look at those three tallest blue bars to the left, those are M&A integration failure, those are competitive issues, those are new product issues. And so moving to the right, the light blue bars are operational risk. Only 13% of the time did that destroy 50% or more of the value in a one-year period. And the next group is legal and compliance, only 6% of the time. And very interestingly, because this was done not so long after the last financial crisis, only 12% of the time was it financial. So, part of the issue here is not just where do the most destructive risks come from, and I would argue also the biggest opportunities for taking incremental and new risk for the purposes of creating value. But where do you focus in terms of the likelihood or frequency of something that might happen versus its consequence or impact? I think the answer is what's at the heart of our roles, and that's prioritization. This is the other graphic I like to use in conjunction with that slide, because even though I think we all get this, this depicts the truth of risk management as it's practiced today in these two buckets. Alex calls them RM1, RM2. I'm going to call them traditional and maybe progressive, all right, risk management. And frankly, so many traditional risk managers focus on expected losses and the things that go on to the left of that red line. And I know that work needs to be done, for sure. I always say do what you're hired to do, and then do what you're aspiring to. And what you can convince others makes more sense to spend time on. But to the right of that point, and all the way down that curve, all the way to where the black swan lives, those highly unlikely things, but those very destructible things that generally aren't insurable, becomes the key question of where do risk managers spend their time, what do they focus on, and really, what's their value proposition in the organization. And it's not a single point along the curve, right? It may be a range. The point of this really is that we need to get beyond that expected loss point, where I would even argue and ask the question, are expected losses risks? Are they underlaid by risks? If they're expected, I consider risk, different varying degrees of uncertainty as a general definition. So you can answer that question for yourself. I just want you guys to, begin thinking about that a little bit. So now we'll move to, at the heart of the matter, which is really influencing others and helping change culture for the purposes of better decision making. So, again, going back to RM1, I think I can safely say this assumes that risk management 1 is done, that it's maybe being reinforced periodically in favor of what really matters to leaders on a prioritized basis, because we all know we never have enough resources to get done what we think we're being asked to do. So that's the key question. What really matters to who? And who are the stakeholders we're trying to serve? I'm going to introduce a competing concept in some sense right now to RM1, RM2. No, maybe not, maybe more complementary. And I didn't tell Alex about this, so we'll see. But I like the idea of RP1 and RP2. And that's about, RP1 is really about the question of why or how could we fail. RP2, or risk prioritization 2, is about the question of how do we succeed? Why do we fail, RP1, and how can we facilitate success, RP2? So I'll refer to that throughout as I move forward. For risk management leaders, I think the question is, how and where do we contribute most effectively in these RP1 and RP2 buckets? So begin to think about that. I want to remind you to put your comments and questions at the bottom, and we'll try to address those as we move forward through this session. So what risks and risk information is relevant, and who is it relevant to, right? So we all know these terms, key risks, right? They mean different things to different people. I'm going to define that as being ideally the most destructive things on the negative side, again, under this prioritization paradigm and construct. But as soon as we can get there, the most opportunistic risks, those things that can help us deliver our mission and our strategic plan. So it's that two-sided coin, right? The bad things and the good things, so to speak, needs to be how we define key risks. We can't ignore emerging risks, and I call it a dilemma because I like to think of it as what I've always heard from senior leaders in my jobs, and that was the question, tell me what I don't know, right? One CEO said, hey, I can read all the stuff you typically have access to, Wall Street Journal, whatever it is, but I need you to kind of get your crystal ball out and tell me what's around that 90-degree bend, what's over the horizon that I have no idea is coming. It could be a major problem for us tomorrow, or better yet, could be an opportunity we haven't thought about to help us get to a more effective performance and mission accomplishment. We need to be understanding in how to manage risks. And I would say that's fundamentally about, do we understand how the business makes money? Okay, I'm assuming we're in the for-profit world at the moment. And then what is our contribution to how that business works? You know, what is our risk management strategy, frankly? Another element that I think is relevant is what I call the digitization of risk and the risk profile. You know, we're all going to be 100% digitized at some point, maybe even physically, who knows? You know, AI is taking us places we can't even envision. But what's happening, and has been happening to organizations for quite some time, is that everything is becoming digitized. And I think, frankly, that means risk managers have a big challenge to climb the technology learning curve so that they understand what the implications of digitization are for the organization and how it operates, how it makes money, how it affects its products and services, and ultimately the outgrowth of that is how it affects the risk profile. What we're always concerned about is how do we do what we need to do with limited resources? So that's an element here as well. Another element is risk talent. You know, do we have a strategy for that? Do we have the right people to do the things we need to do to serve our business and deliver what management expects from us? A skill set, the influencing skill set in particular, but the analytical skill set, the statistical background that we need to get so much of what we should be doing done. You know, this, we can say all day long that this stuff is part of risk management 101, and I believe it should be. It isn't in so many cases. And as I was just discussing with Alex before we started, you know, the truth is that so many B schools don't even use risk management as a part of their curriculum. And you could argue that maybe they shouldn't. Maybe if people understand, you know, how to do monte-carlo, how to do scenario analysis, how to use all those tools that help us, you know, assess risk, analyze risk, and then drive it into the decision-making process, you might never have to use risk management as a moniker. But it's a discipline now, right? And if there's nothing else that we do, we need to be able to learn how to take those kinds of tools and techniques and bring them into the organization to make better decisions. So we need the right people to do that. But we also need a communication strategy. Whether or not you believe in reporting information, you know, through different channels, the truth is the channels need information, they demand it. You can think about it in terms of what regulators and rating agencies expect. And we might call that RM1 and, you know, a perfunctory part of our business. But the truth is the fundamental nature of reporting ought to be, in my view, circumscribed by a formula that I use, which is the right information to the right people at the right time. RI, RP, RT. It sounds simplistic, but the truth of the matter is that so many of us, myself included for a while in my past, just pushed information around organizations without a real regard to how it was going to be used, or even if it was needed to be used for, again, better decision making. So if we use that construct, right information to the right people at the right time, I think we get closer to the outcome we need. We need a training strategy as well, though, because whether or not you believe in risk culture, and I do, which to me is all about getting people to take risk decisions more appropriately, with more rigor, with more of the appropriate information. We have to train and educate people in that. If we want to make them into effective business managers who take account of risk properly, whether you call them risk managers or not, we need a training and education strategy to do that. And then whether or not you believe in process maturity, I think under the continuing improvement strategy that I've always subscribed to, we need to think about how we constantly improve the tools and techniques that we bring to the business for the purposes I've been talking about, and make sure that they're as good as they can be, and make sure that, you know, we're driving a risk-taking culture that is aligned with what management and governance expects, or more particularly, you know, shareholders and stakeholders in particular. Call that one of prudent decision-making or prudent risk-taking, call it what you want. That's kind of the way I think about it. So, reporting on our risk profile is a part of the equation here. Is this risk management one? Probably. Is that a 10% quotient? We can debate that later. But let's just talk about a few of the elements of what is a risk profile, right? First of all, it isn't all risks. Well, technically it is. But if we want to be valued for what we can contribute, we have to decide what we focus on and what we get others to care about most. I'll never forget the day when a friend of mine, the first risk manager for Microsoft, came waving his 500 risk list at us, and we all said the same thing. Well, what are you going to do with that, right? And we can all come up with 500 risks, I suppose. But it's really the 10 or 20 or 30 or whatever number of risks that have the most significance to our success or failure that matter most. So let's get that out of the way right away. Again, as I said earlier, I think the fulcrum is what matters to whom, right? For the purposes of getting to the end game here. Is that partially about key performance indicators and corporate scorecards? I think it is, relative to how we contribute to that, ideally, which in my world is to have ways of measuring risk, call them key risk indicators, aligned with, designed properly so that they're predictive in nature. They can actually tell you what you might expect going forward, with all the right underpinning tools in that design, in the use of those, and then aligning those ideally on a corporate scorecard so that when an objective is being missed, whether it's an enterprise level or otherwise, somebody knows why, and somebody knows where to point their attention to do something about it relative to why that objective, strategic, long-term, operational, short-term, may not being met. Important to know who owns this stuff, and even more important, who has accountability. Is there accountability for risk? Without it, I think in a fear culture particularly, and so many cultures are fear type cultures, all kinds of other cultures, frankly, that where risk isn't dealt effectively with because of the cultural profile. But I think in this case, accountability is at the heart of it. You know, knowing that, you know, to the extent you don't manage your risks effectively and then objectives are missed, you're going to pay a price for it. And vice versa. There's an incentive to manage risk effectively because you get the performance outcomes you're after. Correlations with strategies and objectives. Some might say, well, wait a minute, isn't that strategic risk management as, say, Risk Management Society might define it? Probably, right? If you don't know, strategic risk management is technically defined as just a kind of a laser focus on the risk that affects strategy, the strategic plan, and its execution. Okay, is that what matters most? Maybe. Do we need a new construct to manage to that? Not really. It's just a matter of figuring out what matters, right? And what's prioritization all about in our world. What about the control environment? Do we care about the control environment when the internal auditor's out there running around figuring out whether it works or not? I think we should, because the control environment contains those things that are most commonly used to manage or mitigate risk, you know, testable controls. On the other hand, you know, they involve all kinds of, or they ignore all kinds of things in many cases that have nothing to do, you know, with managing, you know, the risks that matter most. So another thing to think about, but we should care about the control environment. We should care about, you know, whether the right controls are in place for at least the operational risks. But yes, they matter too. So if I'm a senior leader, I'm going to want to know about the things that are not effectively mitigated on the downside. I'm going to want to know about the risks that we're not taking that we need to, or that we should be taking in order to get us to the next level of performance outcomes. So that's where targeted mitigation comes in as an idea. And then whether it's emerging risks or whatever it is, we need to understand trends and how things are changing, especially as it relates to significant exposures that could affect our mission tomorrow versus today. So whether that's new products or services, or whether that's a company we're thinking about acquiring, or a company we're thinking about divesting ourselves of, or whether it's the emergence of new competitors that changes the competitive landscape, or whether it's new regulations that are going to potentially slow, an objective or impede, what we're after. Those are examples of trends and changes that I think we need to care about. Stakeholders, again, they are our partners in crime, is the way I think about it. And I know that's a bad term if you're aligned with the internal auditor. And yes, it's all risk owners at the end of the day, but back to the issue of prioritization. Now we say who matters most. And I'm going to tell you, it's not the board, even though some would say, well, we got to keep the board happy. I don't think it's the C-suite, even though some would say we got to make sure we keep the C-suite happy, the senior leadership. I'm going to say it's where the risk is owned in the business, and that's primarily within the business units themselves. So risk owners rule is what I would say. They have the biggest potential impact on KP1 and KP2. To go back to my construct. So what do we care about relative to risk stakeholders and their issues? Well, first of all, do we even know who they are? Yeah, they're risk owners, and they may be everybody to some degree. But where are the most significant interests in risk and risk management, and risk outcomes in particular, or how risk affects the outcomes we're after? What do they need to know? What do they need to be successful? That is, to manage their risk to the end game. How do we engage them? I say first for their success, right? What do they need from us to reduce the chances of failure to accomplish objectives? And what do they need from us to increase the chances of success in solving problems to get to the end game? And then only after that is it about what we want as risk leaders, right? We need to become valued advisors, strategic advisors to the business, but we'll never get there without putting the priorities of the stakeholders first. But when we've got these relationships and they're working well, I think we're about making them into ideally sensing mechanisms, right? Because we can't be everywhere in the business. We can't know where everything that matters exists. We have to rely on these folks, particularly the risk and control owners. They'll see it first, for sure. They'll see emerging issues and risks before we will. They'll know it better as well than we could ever know it. And they're partners in innovation and improvement, right? They need the tools and techniques to manage mitigations and to manage exploitation of risk on a more consistent basis to get to the end game. So here's one construct, paradigm, whatever you want to call it. Again, focused around prioritization that uses a power and an interest construct, maybe interest/influence, and tries to categorize stakeholders in terms of what they need to know. So keeping them satisfied, is one, focus for high power, low interest and influence stakeholders. The key one here, of course, is those that have the most power and the most influence. We need to manage them closely, right? Mapping them in a construct like this might be one way to get it, considering how to get them and the information they need, and then keeping them engaged in, managing risk as we would call effective risk management, I think is our primary interest and our primary focus. Here's just a graphical construct for thinking about this. You could put anybody in these three bigger circles. I think the way to think about this graphically is just what is it we're all after, right? And the center of all the universes of these stakeholders is what are our objectives, short and long term, and what are the performance outcomes we're after. And then in the secondary circles, you see where we might overlap between risk management in this case, using an example of strategic planning against all other stakeholders. You can populate this with anybody you want. You can repopulate the secondary circles, but I think the universe at the center is always the same. How do we deliver mission against these two things of executing our objectives and delivering the performance outcomes we're after? Let me stop again, guys, and say, put your questions and comments at the bottom, and we'll address those as we move along. All right. And as I said, I think these guys matter most, in terms of the stakeholder world. Business unit management. We need to know what their priorities are. Okay. And, I'll put them as these: implementing the strategies to reach our targets, ensuring tactical execution to get there, and then ultimately informing the folks they're accountable to. They need to know what? To understand and support the risks that are being taken and the ones that are intentionally avoided, for the reasons that they are. Pretty simple construct. So let's keep them as number one. I don't know that it matters that we prioritize from here, but we do have a constituent in the senior most management, and we need to understand what their priorities are. I would say number one is to develop and deliver an executable strategy, understanding their accountability to a board whose accountability is to make sure they're performing. What do they need to know is the question then. They need to understand the relationship between risk and strategy, how they influence each other. We've talked a little bit about that. And they also need to know and understand how current and emerging risks and trends affect execution, affect mission delivery and accomplishment. Finally, the board, what do we want to do? We want to help them succeed, but we can't unless we know what their role is, what it should be. As one boss said to me at one time, don't ask them what they care about relative to risk. Tell them what they need to care about. Okay, I really think that's the right construct. So they need to know, as we talked about earlier, what the things are that matter most from a risk standpoint. And here I'll introduce a term that may not be used commonly, but what are their deficits, right? And by deficit, I simply mean, they don't want to know what's green. They don't care about green. They may not even care about yellow, thinking about the stoplight reporting construct. What they care about is red, and putting some flesh on the bones of what red means. I'm going to call it deficit. So I'll translate that to mean in the negative, risks that aren't effectively managed and are going to potentially keep us from meeting our objectives. On the positive side, a deficit would be risks that aren't being taken that should be in order to meet a planned outcome. So confirming that risk management is effective is the other key thing they should care about, and that means having the right leadership in place who have hopefully hired the right expertise with the right skills to get ahead of threats and opportunities to the mission delivery, to the long-term strategy, but also to the short-term operational strategy. Then they want to ideally be involved in at least saying, yeah, we agree with your strategy, your risk strategy. We agree with the corporate strategy, the strategic plan itself. We agree that we should take as much risk as we do, that we have the ability to do so, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And that, yes, we do have the right risk leadership in place, and that, most importantly, they're effective. They'll get that from the auditor, whether they like it or not. Is that all they need to know? Probably not. So they need to go beyond just an auditor saying, yeah, it looks like a successful, effectively, maybe efficiently working process area. But I guarantee you the auditors aren't asking all the right questions in most cases to really get to what I'll define at the end of this presentation as true effectiveness. And then, as I said, let's tell them what they don't know, because that's what they really want to know. So understanding board's key priorities, which is to discharge their governance and risk oversight responsibility and ensuring the execution to mission accomplishment, means they need to know about the most critical risks that could prevent that. They need to know about risk profile deficits, as I just defined deficits. They need to know about mitigation deficits, and they need to know that there is risk ownership and accountability as a part of the cultural imperative, meaning that risk is owned, and when it goes bad, there's somebody that's going to be accountable. And when it goes well, and according to plan, somebody's getting rewarded for it. That's a construct that I've been able to prove over my background and history makes all the difference in the world as to whether people actually get engaged effectively about risk management and the management of decisions relative to the risk information they need to do so. So let's just look at a couple of risk reporting examples. Consider this business unit risk owner level information, but what do we want here? We want actionable reporting information or risk information to get to decision makers. We want to make sure that those decision makers understand the link between risk and the opportunities as they relate to strategic objectives primarily, but also operational objectives, more short term, and understand where the significant risks are to the business and the business strategy. So here's some examples. Strengthen quality and compliance, to become world-class. You see example risks underneath that, the impact of outsourcing, the failure to stay abreast of regulation. Another being successfully launch new products, a risk being the inadequate staffing that could ensue if we don't have the right people in place. Risk two to this particular objective being the delay in speed to market, where we anticipated moving more quickly than we did. Another example of a goal would be to be number one in overseas markets, where the risk is to not anticipate competition effectively or to not understand demand effectively. All this stuff needs to be measured and measurable so we can get to values for these things, so we can input it into the decision-making process accordingly. The next question becomes, how reliable are they? And how much can we actually use them for predicting the success that we're after relative to the execution of our strategy? And then the last question needs to be, if we need to mitigate risks differently, do we have alternatives to doing that? And by the way, that would include actually modifying our strategies, maybe eliminating them. It isn't just about changing the risk. It may be about changing the strategic objectives as well. So let's move into risk-based decisions that support strategy and mission. Again, remind you to put your questions and comments at the bottom so we can anticipate those. So whether or not you buy into having risk appetite strategy as a requirement, and I don't get me wrong, I want to take a simplified look at this issue, because I do think we need to understand, in order to make the best risk decisions, answers to these questions. How much risk are we taking? As against how much risk we have the capacity to take, as against how much risk we prefer to take. And you could put any labels on these things you want: appetite, tolerance, limits. It doesn't matter what you call them. I'm talking about a simplified view that says, at least have an understanding of this, because I don't know how you can make intelligent decisions relative to risk unless you have some sense of this. And most particularly the fourth item that really is the heart of the matter. How much risk do we need to take in order to deliver what we're saying we're after? Over whatever period of time we're after it, ideally to reach our strategic goals. And then we have our preferences, right? How much risk do individual risk takers want to take? Kind of less important if they're aligned with what we need to do, right? But then the question of where are the gaps between our ability and our need to take risk? And then what strategies may need to be modified? And then what is the cost-benefit analysis of the different approaches to mitigation that we may engage, for these purposes? So, a simplified view of risk appetite. Hopefully you find that somewhat useful. Here's just some examples of how risk appetite can be expressed quantitatively in the first setting, right? Targeted regulatory capital, economic capital surplus, financial ratings, return on equity, the extent of our dividend commitment, and even the concentration we might have in large customers or single customers. And then the qualitative, which frankly is much less useful, but it begins to get people thinking about and understanding, the questions on the prior page. So here you have, we want to have the best reputation, we want to have the best people, we want to limit our markets to a particular geographic area. In some sense, all motherhood and apple pie. You can't really manage to that. But having an understanding of some of those qualitative elements, I think, is the first step to getting to the more quantitative answers to the questions on the previous slide. So measuring and monitoring, where we're going and how we're getting there, I think, is our next consideration. Key performance indicators are the things that define whether we're getting there or not, but they're backward looking, right? So having key risk indicators tied to them and designed properly allows us to look forward and predict the future. but not without, the proper design. We've talked about risk ownership, but we need a process for information flow to decision makers because we're not going to be with them all the time. It's really, in my view, back to RM1, what kind of training and education and communication are we engaging the culture to make them risk aware? So that risk awareness becomes part of their DNA so that we don't have to be there to hold their hand. We've enabled them by tools and techniques to do their own thing. And then we play whatever broker, intermediary, advisory role is necessary as called upon to do so. That collaborative alignment we need with the key stakeholders and the information they need in organizations and key risk stakeholders like compliance and audit. We need to develop a process though, for closing gaps on the identification and closure of issues with risk owners themselves, at least in the more significant areas. We need to develop channels for information flow. Since big data is consuming us, it will subsume us all unless we get our ability to manage that and vet it and extract from it what we need for the purposes we've been discussing, right? And that's taking vetted, subsets of information from the big data universe, using it in the tools that we use to get to those better decisions. I like to think sometimes we need, to be prepared for the new normal, whether it's being driven by digitization, as I alluded to earlier. It's a recognition of some key things like, number one, risk is not a project, it's not an initiative, right? It's a way of doing business, I think. It's an enhancement to the business model that uses information and the sources of information in more effective ways to get to our end game. It helps decision makers get to those better outcomes. It helps strike a balance between quantification, the controls, and the variety of risk techniques that we use and will use in the future as new techniques come online to avoid risk speak as a part of this. And I say, learn to talk the language of organizations, which I think is finance. And I'm a little biased because I have an MBA in finance, but so be it. The language of organizations is finance. It's not risk management. So don't confuse people with risk speak. It's supporting risk decision-making or decision-making generally with risk information by understanding appetite and tolerance as a guidance, not as an explicit, rules-based thing, but more of an understanding, as I alluded to earlier, about capabilities to take risk versus the actual needs in order to deliver a plan. It's about promoting risk-taking on a consistent basis as well. It's about embedding these techniques and tools and capabilities into the business so that people know what to use to inform their decisions without having to ask us, as risk leaders. How do we improve awareness? I don't know. Is that what Risk Awareness Week is all about? Awareness and capabilities. Well, here's 5 things we might think about. What is material? And I'm not talking about materiality as an auditor might define it. That's not probably relevant. I'm talking about materiality as it matters to the key decisions that get us to our strategic outcomes. I'm talking about not relying on just what comes up from the bottom, but considering, what comes from the top as well and using that blended perspective to get to better assessments of risk. I'm talking about integrating financial and operational risks together with other types of risks so that a holistic portfolio view can be had to understand the true risk profile of an organization. I'm talking about being proactive, not reactive, right? That'll get us a lot of mileage with our constituents. And I'm talking about inciting people to take action with that ideally actionable information we're providing them. So I want to wrap this up with a few more things, just some, I used to call them my risk quips or Chris's quips or whatever. You can call them what you want. But as I said, I've been doing a little work on risk effectiveness over the last couple of years and trying to get other people to answer the question, what does this mean? What do you consider risk management effectiveness? One risk leader said to me, as a CRO for a huge educational institution, she said, more than anything, I just want to be the department of yes. And all she's really saying is, I want to work with to enable the business to get to its end game. I don't want to be an impediment to that. I don't want to be the, the department of no. I want to be the department of yes. So in doing so, I think it means our ability and our trusted advisory status to be able to influence planners and how strategic and operational goals are set to develop the strategy that would improve the chances of success and reduce the chances of performance volatility that everybody hates, right? You'll always have some of it, but to reduce the volatility generally. To be prepared for the unexpected, because that'll always be a part of our universe. And you don't want to be the person asked, how did we miss that, right? And that's why I don't believe emerging risks as an issue or as a risk process can be ignored. I think we need evidence that risk management is reflected in our core processes. And I think the evidence, and the only evidence you need ultimately, is to see people making better decisions. And how do we know that that happens? When the outcomes thereafter are actually achieved or being more closely achieved. I think it's enabling board oversight, as we discussed. I think it's reducing the frequency of near misses. Every little near miss can be a catastrophic miss under the right set of circumstances. So we can't just ignore the small stuff. Operational risk was ignored by a lot of risk leaders for a long time, but when death by 1,000 cuts became a consideration because the customer was increasingly unhappy with the transactional nature of businesses, it became a cumulative reputational problem. And that can kill a business pretty quickly. It's things like reducing the cost of capital, improving shareholder value, which I think we have a role in doing all this stuff to get to those end games. And it's increasing risk sensitivity or risk sensing capability and awareness in the culture for the reasons mentioned. All right. 2 pages of wisdom from Chris Mandel. Take it for what it's worth. Questions to think about. Why would you invest in and prioritize risk management if it didn't directly affect the success of your organization? Right? In a risk-free world, we never would. And we'll never be in a risk-free world. But I don't know that we would invest in risk management unless it contributed to success. What about this question? Is, as I alluded to earlier, risk with an expected value really a risk? When you consider that risk is really uncertainty? Think about it. Realize that risk managers don't own risk, but they enable risk owners to do so effectively. Emerging risks may or may not be black swans, but they should be on the radar of every risk leader because you're going to probably pay the price if they come back to haunt an organization and somehow you missed it, or you didn't enable the risk owner to get ahead of that issue. And then we need to be telling risk leaders what they don't know, right? Not what they can find out from anybody and any other source. Tell them what they don't know. Last set. All decisions entail some element of risk. The difference is only a matter of degree. Innovation is critical to success, and guess what? We can't take and do innovative things without taking risks, so we better get the connection. While insurance is important to business transaction, I would say to a smooth economy, globally and otherwise, it's just a risk mitigation technique. So don't give it too much emphasis and credit when the real impact may be coming from elsewhere. Don't forget about building organizational resilience, right? Where it's not so much a matter of what causes it as much as what it could do to us if it happens. That whole issue of how do we prioritize impact and consequence versus probability and frequency, where probability and frequency, no matter how much data we have, may be, less reliable than we really think. I mean, just think about the financial crisis itself and think about how many risk models were relied upon in that world, particularly in financial services, that failed. You could argue risk management failed miserably in the last financial crisis. We don't want to go there again. With disruption being the frequent occurrence it is in the business world, I think we need to consider the fact that there's going to be a regular redefinition of our risk landscape, and as a result, our risk profile. And finally, I like to end with digitization. Some may disagree. that I think it's the biggest challenge ahead for risk leaders of the future. Not to become technology experts, not to become CTOs, but to just understand how technology is affecting everything and will be so going forward. Let me leave you with a quote I've rested on for a long time from Peter Drucker. A decision that doesn't involve risk probably isn't a decision. With that, I thank you for your attention. I thank you for your time, your comments and questions. Please keep them coming. I hope I conveyed some wisdom and knowledge to you, and I thank you for attending today. Enjoy Risk Awareness Week.